Welcome to Fresh Outlook. I'm Frank Cipolla. Being a journalist is more dangerous now than it's ever been. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports more than 200 members of the news media are in prisons around the world. And the situation in Turkey, especially, is an example of how dangerous reporting the news has become. But first, we start in the U.S.
Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. That's a portion of the First Amendment as to how freedom of speech is defined in the United States. Well, sort of. While on the surface, the First Amendment may appear to be a licensed carte blanche, numerous gray areas exist which continue to be argued. Some of those gray areas heard by the courts include public forum regulation, inciting, provocative or offensive speech, prior restraint, expressive conduct, commercial speech, defamation, and privacy. In the United States, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 led to a drastic reduction of ownership diversity of the mainstream media. The remaining outlets are increasingly criticized as being transformed from the legendary Fourth Estate to a propaganda tool for their corporate owners. Yet, in the U.S., a rogue reporter fears at most the loss of his job. Overseas, it is often more serious. Recently, in Turkey, reporters investigating a purported corruption scandal within the government found themselves in jail, their media outlets raided, and heavy reprisals from the government. Last December, the U.S.-based Committee to Protect Journalists listed Turkey as being in the world's top 10 worst countries for jailing journalists. In Hungary, Prime Minister Orban's new media law dictates 229 pages of restrictions on free expression and politicized means of enforcing those limits. As countries like Serbia ascend the road to EU membership, free press issues are raised. Back here in the United States, keep in mind, one only needs to look at ag-gag laws for a reminder that free speech is not necessarily carte blanche.
Now, joining me to discuss the situation for journalists in Turkey and elsewhere is Paul Levinson. He teaches media studies at Fordham University. Also live via our D.C. connection, Courtney Radsch, who's an advocacy director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and media analyst Jackie Guzda from Western Connecticut State University. Also via Skype from Serbia, she's a journalist there, is Danica Radisic. All of you, welcome to the panel today. We appreciate your time as we discuss this issue. Turkey, in the last several years, has become a very dangerous place for journalists. In fact, as of the beginning of 2014, 40 journalists were imprisoned there, and it's leading now. It's the second consecutive year that it has the most journalists in prison and jailed. And why Turkey, this country for many, many decades, which is a very peaceful place, has suddenly become very dangerous for journalists?
Well, this sometimes, unfortunately, happens when the situation gets worse. For example, there's domestic unrest, there are military adversaries, and what's going on in the Middle East, obviously, between ISIS and Al-Qaeda before that, is the region is in a serious state of unrest, and when you throw the Arab Spring into that, that makes people uncomfortable. And unfortunately, very often governments, even democratic governments, and not only Turkey, but here in the U.S., react to that by cracking down on journalists. And that's the worst thing to do.
Well, Jackie, you teach future journalists in your media studies class. They see it's a dangerous world. They see it's going in all sorts of directions. How do you convince somebody that this is still a noble profession when we see so many journalists jailed around the world?
Well, I think our students find that extremely exciting. They want to be in the middle of the fray. But, you know, look, here's the thing. It's that in Turkey, this country is becoming more and more conservative, I would say, over the last 5 years. And that's coming from the top, from the Erdogan administration. They're pulling back into this conservatism where Turkey actually was becoming part of the EU. It was going more into the liberal side. And so you've got this clash here.
Okay, we're going to discuss the EU with regard to Turkey in just a moment, but let's go to Courtney Radsch in Washington, D.C. You see this as well around the world. Does it concern you, Courtney?
Absolutely. I think that we're deeply concerned that the past 3 years have been the most dangerous on record for journalists. We've had record numbers of killings of journalists, record numbers of imprisonment. Thankfully, Turkey, which was the leading jailer of journalists 2 years running with a high of 61 journalists in prison, now, according to our latest prison census in December 2014, had 7 journalists in prison. But I think that what we see is this is indicative of a broader trend around the world in which leaders are not interested in tolerating dissent or criticism, reporting or commentary on things that they don't like. And journalists are on the front lines around the world trying to do this. And there's an increasing imbalance of power between journalists and authorities, and I think part of that is brought on by shifting technologies where journalists aren't really in that privileged position that they used to be in.
Now, you bring up a very good point, because social media now has given rise to a lot of citizen journalists without the proper training and so on and so forth, and that just leads to the overall message we're coming out there. How big of a part is social media, Courtney, do you think, in all of this?
I think social media is a big part of it because it's expanded the ability of people to engage in acts of journalism, but I don't think the problem is social media and the people who are using that. I think it's the problem that governments and authorities and other powerful figures are able to bypass journalists who used to play this important filtering role. So now, instead of having to use journalists to get out their message, they can bypass and get it out directly on social media. And at the same time, we're seeing a crackdown on the internet, on social media around the world, including in Turkey. There was just a bill passed there that is deeply troublesome that would allow the blocking of websites without a court order. There was a similar bill proposed earlier that was struck down by the Constitutional Court, but there's, the continuing attempts to restrict the internet. We were actually in Turkey late last year and met with President Erdogan, and were shocked by his outright hostility towards the internet.
All right, we're going to come back.
A critical part of not only modern journalism but the economy. We're
going to come back to Turkey in just a moment, but we're going to bounce on the other side of the world now to one of the Serbian journalists in Serbia, Danica Radisic. You have issues as well in Serbia where there is a concern about how you do business there as a journalist, correct? Tell us about them.
Yes, absolutely. Just one quick correction. I'm not a journalist. I am a media consultant and a communications consultant.
Alrighty.
I'm also editor for Central and Eastern Europe for Global Voices. We prefer to call it citizen journalism because there are so many journalists out there trying to do, as Courtney mentioned, a great job and fight some of this.
So what are your concerns?
Yeah, well, we do have the same issue in Serbia, and it sort of feels not just in Serbia, but in Hungary and Macedonia and other countries in the region as well. It kind of feels like governments here are taking a lead from Erdogan and trying to retain power by clamping down on media and by controlling the information that gets out to people and what doesn't get out.
How do you combat that?
It's very difficult. First of all, the financial pressures are tremendous, and people, including journalists, do need to make a living. So it's extremely difficult. I don't honestly know a way out. Social media may be a part of it, but social media not only can't substitute professional journalism and the professional curation of information and how it's presented to people, but social media can also be abused. And governments such as the Russian government and the Serbian government as well, they use a little something that we here in Serbia call bots, which are pretty much trained people to who comment on social media and on websites and on articles on websites, trying to sway opinions in the direction in which, the powers to be would want them to sway it in.
All right, let me hold you right there and come back to our panel here. I've seen in my role as journalist in the last 10, 20 years or so, that there is a movement by those in power to prevent access to them unless you go the course, unless you follow the program. And if you are critical or too critical of them, you're iced out. And of course, the reporter's life and blood is you got to get access to the power makers, the movers and shakers.
Well, the notion that the government somehow has to qualify or certify a journalist is antithetical to the very principle of journalism that reporters are reporting and covering
independently
the
reporting.
Totally independently. And this actually does have something to do with social media. Someone somehow came up with the idea that you have to be a credentialed journalist working for an established newspaper or radio station or television station to report the news. That's not true. The only credential you need to report the news is you're a human being who has an experience, and you may have a camera on your phone and you can take a picture of something or video something.
Look, I love citizen journalism. I love it because we're seeing things through different perspectives in different places that we never had a chance to see before. However, here's the thing, is that these people are not trained, and so you have a problem there. You also have a problem with things coming over that are erroneous. You know, if I see something in a particular way and I don't particularly see it for its realism, well, I'm going to present it from my point of view, and that's a problem.
Well, you talk about something that I've been complaining about for years, where I think a famous reporter once said, I will trust a citizen journalist when I trust a citizen surgeon. So, you know, there's a certain skill set that you need to know, and we might disagree.
The surgeon's a matter of life and death. If the surgeon makes a mistake, the patient can die. The worst that can happen with a citizen journalist is, yes, the news can be reported incorrectly, but what about Brian Williams? There are lots of errors that traditional journalists make all the time.
Okay, Courtney, let's bounce back to you. Where do you stand on this particular issue?
I mean, I think that is a little bit problematic because the fact is that professional journalists and citizen journalists exist in the same ecosystem. And so we see that citizen journalist material is being used by professional journalists. So they need to know how to authenticate and validate that material, how to, you know, the different tools that are out there, as opposed to just say posting something and giving it the validity of, you know, a mainstream trusted news outlet without first verifying it. So I think that's a bit disingenuous, but there's this, you know, race to be first and this race to get out the, you know, the information. And so I think sometimes you see cutting corners in terms of validating information, but I don't think, you know, we should say that all professional journalists are trained and all citizen journalists are untrained. I think Global Voices is a perfect example of citizen journalism. These people are doing fantastic work and many of them have been trained, and, you know, we can't just say that, oh, somebody did a training and therefore you know, they're ready to go. I think that we have to look at the ecosystem that we're in, and the fact is we see around the world that professional and citizen journalists alike are being impacted by restrictive laws, by the clampdown on dissent and criticism, especially in the Middle East and in parts of Europe. And the ecosystem is changing, so I think rather than putting them in opposition to each other, we should see how can they enhance journalism together, and that, you know, these professional journalists need to use that material but understand how to validate it.
All right, let's bring in Danica here. When you're doing business in Serbia, or journalists are doing business in Serbia where there is some repression with regard to what you should know and don't know, whom do you trust at that point? Do you go with social media, or do you go with the traditional media?
It's not just about whom to trust. It's also about what might happen, the consequences of reporting certain things. A great example, as Paul just mentioned, you have accreditation. There are accreditation issues. Journalists in Serbia are mostly presented with questions that they are allowed to pose at a press conference, and what they aren't allowed to pose, of course, we're talking about press conferences related mostly to the government and to authorities. Last year there was a great example of an independent journalist, Serbian independent journalist, Natalija Miletic, during Prime Minister Vučić's official visit to Germany with Angela Merkel, and of course there was a press conference after their talks, and an independent journalist by the name of Natalia Militic posed a couple of questions that the Prime Minister did not like, and according to her, she was told by the Serbian embassy in Germany and others that she would never again receive an accreditation for any government-related press conference.
Yeah, we talk about that access, absolutely.
Right.
All right, Danica, we have...
So it's difficult to, it's not just whether to trust social media, it's, whether to risk trusting a lead, even if you know it's verified, and what's going to happen to you if you do a real story, if you do your job as a journalist.
All right, Danica, we're going to have to leave it there. We thank you so much. Courtney as well, thank you for joining us in this discussion. When we come back, Fresh Outlook will continue our discussion of the treatment of journalists around the world, focusing especially on the latest crackdown in Turkey. We'll be right back.